Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fullest podcast. I'm your host, Nikki Bostwick, and today's guest is Nick Corbishley, who's a journalist with a global perspective who specializes in breaking news, finance, and politics. Formerly a senior contributing editor at the San Francisco-based economics and finance news site Wolf Street, he is currently a regular contributor to the U.S. financial news and analysis blog Naked Capitalism, where he writes about financial, economic, and political developments in Europe and Latin America. He's the author of Scanned: Why Vaccine Passports and Digital IDs Will Mean the End of Privacy and Personal Freedom. Hi, Nick.
Hi there, Nikki.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm so honored to have you on, and I personally have so many questions around this topic. And so I wanted to say thank you for your work and for just everything that you are putting out there and the book that you just put out there. I think it's so incredible that you're putting yourself and your career on the line for this. A lot of censorship going on right now. And so anyone who's willing to share about the truth, I just want to say thank you and that I'm honored to have you on.
Well, it's good to be with you.
So I'd love to get started with just the general question here, I guess, is what ended up drawing you to the issue of vaccine passports and digital IDs? I know you have, your history and your career is in finance and politics. And so I'm curious what drew you to this particular issue.
Well, I mean, I've been writing about a very broad range of issues for the last 9 or 10 years. And one of those issues is the war on cash, which is something that has been progressively escalated over the last decade or so, and certainly since the pandemic began. And I've also been writing about things like biometric identifiers and the potential risks they pose to privacy. And that's going back a number of years now. So it's not completely new to me. What happened is that when I saw what was happening in Israel in February 2021, when they became the first kind of advanced economy, if you want to call it that, to go down the route of launching a vaccine passport, I saw that there was virtually no attention being given to it in the mainstream press, at least attention given to the darker sides, which was like the segregation and the discrimination and this kind of like creation of a constant surveillance system. And this was not being covered by the mainstream media. And I saw that it was going to become a reality as well in the European Union, where I live, shortly after that. So I began digging into it and began writing articles about the risks I saw it as posing to our basic freedoms and to our privacy and to many other things that we unfortunately take for granted in this day and age. As luck would have it, in July, an independent publisher in the United States called Chelsea Green got in touch with me, and they'd been following my articles on this issue, and they wanted to discuss the possibility of kind of expanding them into a small book. And Scanned is the result of that partnership. So it's been a very interesting journey since then.
So incredible. I know you touched on, the fact that mainstream media wasn't really talking much. I mean, this has been going on probably forever, but it was just so heightened during the last few years that there's so many issues that they're not really diving into in regards to this, the vaccine passports, the pandemic, or just like the real data around it. And I believe that it has a lot to do with like the sponsorships for the media channels, of course. But I'm curious, I guess I want to get into the financial incentives behind the vaccine and vaccine passports. But before, I guess, maybe you can just explain like digital IDs and why the vaccine passports are a gateway to digital identification for all, and getting into how that's obviously a huge issue and why Europe this should have been a red flag for everyone, but especially Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the way to begin this is by discussing what a vaccine passport actually is. So I mean, I'm sure in the United States, there are lots of places that have launched their own vaccines passports. So you've got, I think it's something like 21 states, if I'm not mistaken, that have already launched some form of vaccine passports. But there may be lots of states that haven't, or there are lots of states that haven't. So maybe some of your listeners are not fully aware of what they really are. So I mean, a vaccine passport is a digital document that is supposed to certify that you are up to date on the COVID-19 vaccinations, and that status of being up to date changes as more and more booster shots are added into the mix. So I think in the United States, to be considered up to date, you have to have had three shots in total, including that one booster shot. But now I think the FDA, if I'm not mistaken, has authorized another booster shot for people over the age of 50. So again, that could be changing at some point in the not too distant future. But it differs. This digital document changes. To qualify, the conditions are different in each jurisdiction. So in Europe, for example, if you have had a recent negative PCR test, then that can give you very kind of like short period of eligibility. So if you want to go to an event, if you want to travel, then it can come into play there. There's also the possibility if you've had a recent infection and you can prove that you've had a recent infection with a positive PCR test, then that gives you 6 months eligibility for the vaccine passport. So that is more or less how it works here in Europe, which is, I think, the region of the world with kind of like the most vaccine passports per person. It's all a little bit strange right now because the situation surrounding the vaccine passports is kind of constantly in flux. So we're in a situation where in Europe, for example, many countries are withdrawing their use or reducing their use at domestic applications. So this means that, for example, in the UK, you don't need the vaccine passport for just about anything, and that includes entering the country right now. So it's almost like being completely resigned or pushed back to the back burner completely. In Spain, where I live, it's a similar story. In France, they're withdrawing its use or reducing its use for domestic applications. And then you have countries like Germany and Italy, where it's still being used in quite a number of areas. So that is the current state of play, at least in Europe, regarding the vaccine passports. Now, the question as to why they are kind of like a precursor to digital identity, I think that is the case on a number of different levels. So number one, a lot of the companies that have helped to develop the technologies for the vaccine passports, they have openly admitted in many kind of like many of their blogs and other kind of like technological publications, they've openly admitted that vaccine passports are very much the beginning to digital identity. So it's just the first step along this path. If you want, I can quote what a guy called Andrew Budd of iProve, a London-based company that sells facial recognition, had to say. I mean, the company helped produce the British Corona application. So he said, the evolution of vaccine certificates will actually drive the whole field of digital identity in the future. So therefore, this is not just about COVID, this is about something even bigger. And you can see many, many other examples like this, which I quote in my book. So it's because it's kind of like it's allowing governments to lay the tracks for the systems that will eventually be digital identity. It's kind of like a foot in the door, and we're now a year down. I would say a year and a bit down this path, And already, if you look at what many governments are very quietly saying, not openly saying this again, this isn't being properly reported, but I mean, like, they are launching digital identity programs at the same time as they're kind of supposed to be bringing, or what should we say, consigning the vaccine passports to the back burner. So this is one of the most important things that are happening right now. A second thing that is really important for people to grasp is that the vaccine passports have normalized this idea of living in a checkpoint society, in a digital checkpoint society. So, so we have been conditioned in countries where vaccine passports have been used. We've been conditioned to the idea of taking out our mobile phone every time we want to access a particular venue or a particular service or a particular amenity. And this is this is crucial to the ultimate goal of creating a kind of digital identity society.
It's so interesting to me because on one hand we have people fighting for, just not non-discrimination across the board, and the media is covering this nonstop. And on the other hand, those same people are pushing this agenda, which is so wild to me that people don't see right through it. Because in my opinion, every single person, and I'm sure this is your opinion, should be against this, because whether or not they've gotten the vaccine, this is a huge issue. And that's why I really appreciate your work in your book, because the real issue here is our freedom. And like you said, normalizing this checkpoint society. It's not that, oh, but you need it because it's a public health thing and vaccines have been around. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned this. Like, it's the same thing in the United States. Like you mentioned, they're backtracking in terms of making it required, which I always think there's an agenda behind that too, because right now it's like going to be election time and they have, a lot of people are upset. So they obviously don't want to require it and then make people think that it went away. And then most likely, in my opinion, they're just going to bring it back full force. Like you said, they're already working on all of this in terms of digital identification. So I want to get into your opinion on that, but I also find it just like, I just think, you know, the vaccine issue to begin with is really interesting, how all of a sudden it's gone away. Another thing to mention is it's not like all of a sudden these truckers in Canada or anyone who didn't want the vaccine, it's not like all of a sudden these people got it. Like, people were fired and were willing to have nothing because they didn't want to be mandated these things in order to live their lives. And then it's interesting to me because I think a lot of people forget that those people didn't just all of a sudden get it and then coronavirus went away. It's like now people just didn't have it and then things have opened up. And it's so interesting to me how, in order to be considered fully vaccinated, you have to have 4 shots, or almost 4 shots. Right now it's 3 shots, like you said, but they just approved the 4th booster here in the United States. And it's like, okay, well, if I decided to go get vaccinated tomorrow, then I should have the same level, technically, of immunity as someone who is just boosted. So why do I need the 4th one? But I think it's because, again, they just want to keep people in this habit, right, of needing to go do this in order to get access to this. So anyways, I'm curious what your thoughts are on why they're backtracking all over the place with not requiring it anymore, but then they're still moving forward with this technology.
Well, I mean, it's like they've taken, or at least it seems to me, they've taken kind of like 10 very giant steps forward in terms of radically reconfiguring the way our societies function and the way our economies function. And they've taken a couple of steps back. And that is a very effective way of kind of like of governing. you take away huge numbers of, should we say, rights and freedoms for a certain sector of the population, you get, I think, you get to see, you test the the way the public reacts to that. So I mean, one thing that I think is interesting is if you consider that, in many populations in Europe, most people did not really care about the levels of segregation and discrimination that were taking place. That's a scary thing. I think that that is the result largely of huge amounts of fear being applied, um, very high doses of misinformation. And it seems like most people have been willing to go along with that. And I think that, I mean, that didn't necessarily shock me. I mean, I'm a student of history, and one of the staggering things about the 1930s was the degree to which populations, very civilized, very advanced countries, were quite happy to embrace totalitarian systems of government that were clearly harmful and some might even say evil. They were willing to embrace those. So I think that this has been one of the darkest lessons from the last year and a half or so, is the way that people can be galvanized to embrace systems of governance that essentially do away with the rights and freedoms of a certain minority of the population. Because the lessons of history are that if a government is willing to strip one minority of the population of those rights and freedoms and to essentially target a large part of the population or encourage a large population to hate that group, which is what we went through not so long ago, they are willing to do it with any other minority group. And that is exactly what we saw with the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s. It's what we've seen in numerous other totalitarian systems. The web always grows. The enemy of the state may begin as a small group of people, but it's always expanded. The definition is always expanded. So I think that that is something that we have seen happen, and they've kind of like, I would say to a large extent, our governments and the corporations and the thought leaders and the institutions, the supranational institutions that are largely pushing this along, they are, I think, quite happy with what they've achieved to date, and taking a couple of small steps backwards is not necessarily a bad thing. But I mean, like, one thing that I've been trying to tell people as much as possible over the last month and a half, 2 months since I finished my book, is that the World Health Organization does seem to be on the verge of instituting vaccine passports at a global level. I mean, like, they are finally talking about embracing them as in their recommendations for the 194 signatory states. Now, if they did that, if they actually go ahead and do that, then that would theoretically mean that vaccine passports are not only going to become permanent, but they will be applied universally, that is, by all countries. So I mean, it's completely opposite to what we are being told, which is that the vaccine passport is more or less gone, is no longer something that we need to worry about. If the World Health Organization goes ahead with this, then countries where vaccine passports have not been used. So, for example, my wife's country of birth, Mexico, which we visited back in December, I mean, they don't have a vaccine passport system in place. But if the World Health Organization was to recommend it, the pressure on the government, on the Mexican government, to put that into practice will be significant. And as I've also been warning, if the global pandemic treaty is signed, which again, most people have no idea about.
I've been following along, but not like that closely lately, and I have no idea about it. So please educate us on it.
Okay, I mean, like, this is something that has been under negotiation for months and months. Um, all governments are debating this right now. And if it is passed, which is looking increasingly likely, then it will give the World Health Organization a lot more teeth when it comes to affecting health policy in each country around the world. So, I mean, right now, the World Health Organization has limited powers. It can make recommendations about what governments should do, but it can't go so far as to actually enforce those recommendations, at least not significantly. But if this global pandemic treaty is passed, then it means that they will be able to sanction governments that do not follow its recommendations. And that
Wow.
should terrify everybody on planet Earth, because what that means is that you will have an unaccountable, unelected, supranational organization able to dictate health policy for vis-a-vis pandemics, but this could just be the first step. And we would be in a position, it's been bad enough, I would argue, in the last 2 years to actually prevent governments from taking certain actions that are against the public health interests of the populations. But at least with governments, you can replace them every 4 or 5 years if you're living in a democratic country. But
Yeah.
if the World Health Organization is able to take this power, is given this power, then yeah, we will have much less ability to shape our public health policy within our own countries.
As you may or may not know, we've been sharing the benefits of saffron with our community for a little while now. Growing up in a Persian family, I'd been aware of the benefits of saffron because of its prevalence in my mother's cooking. But as we began on the journey to create our own line of saffron-based products, I began to learn the powerful science behind the plant. Saffron has been used by many cultures for thousands of years, and now the research is backing it up, proving that just 30 milligrams of saffron per day is a natural source for enhanced emotional and physical well-being. At the fullest, we believe that incorporating ancient wisdom into our modern lives is one of the most powerful and accessible paths to healing. We also believe that everyone's journey is unique. So for our latest launch, we've created a line of saffron products in a variety of formats to help you curate saffron in your personal daily routine. Warm Feelings is our saffron latte powder and comes in individual sachets and in larger sustainable glass jars. Made with just certified high-grade saffron, organic coconut powder, and cardamom, it's the perfect coffee alternative and feel-good start to your day. If you prefer to pop a pill, Kinder Thoughts is our 30-day supply of saffron capsules and a super simple way to support your body and mood with the power of saffron. And if you're looking to strengthen your immune system, try our Mindful Immunity Syrup. This healing blend uses saffron to reduce inflammation, but also harnesses the power of an ancient Middle Eastern berry called barberries to fight infection, along with sea buckthorn and elderberries, all in a base of manuka honey to aid in antibacterial healing. It's a true immunity powerhouse. Honestly, at the moment, I'm using each of these products on a daily basis depending on my needs. And to help you begin your own saffron journey, we're offering a discount of 15% off just for our podcast listeners with code TheFullestPodcast at checkout. I hope you enjoy your new daily saffron ritual. What can countries what countries have to do it if the World Health Organization, I know you mentioned like 194, but can a country like pull out? And you're saying they can't because like how can they just put sanctions on countries? That's insane. And we've already had such a difficult time with global supply chain issues just because of these mandates. Like it's wild to think that they can just do that. So, for example, let's say I was a really small country like Costa Rica or something. The World Health Organization's recommendations would then, like, it's not like you can pull, is every country part of the World Health Organization? Give us a little bit of a
No,
history.
pretty much. I mean, 194 countries. I don't think there are many more countries. I think there are a few countries that are not members, but it's very few. So if you think about all the countries on the planet, that are, should we say, official established countries. They're all members of the World Health Organization.
So there's literally nowhere for us to go other than just to fight this. But who can we pressure in order to, like, is there anything, like you're saying, we can pressure our government or place pressure on them or reelect them if we're in a democratic country? How can we have a say in what's going on right now with this specific treaty?
It's not going to be easy. I mean, if you live in a democratic country with where you have communication, some degree of so should I say, some ability to apply some degree of pressure on your local or state representative, then that's at the least of the beginning of what we can do. I think that most importantly, we need to inform people, because if I think about most people I know, the vast majority of them have no idea this is even happening. And a lot of people who, you try to tell are, they just don't show much of an interest. So I think that the only way we can stop this from happening is if we manage to get enough, or should we say, enough motion, enough of a critical mass behind it, or rather than behind it, opposed to it. So the only way we get a critical mass is if enough people are talking about it. Which is why the book I've written is so important, because there are so few books that are actually talking about the risks of digital identity, the risks of vaccine passports. And I mentioned the pandemic treaty in the final chapter because I only found out about it in the final phases of writing this book. But since then, they've made strides towards getting this in place. And it's not going to be on your nightly news. It's not going to be on the front cover of the New York Times. It's not going to be on the front cover of the Guardian. It's just simply not. The only way they can pull off this, what I think is a form of coup, is if most people have no idea it's happening.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I mean, we need to get the word out. Like, I didn't know about it. Do you know when they're voting on it?
I think it's looking like it's going to be in the next 6 to 9 months. It's not absolutely clear. Again, it's not clear because there's so little information out about it, but it's looking like it's going to be in the next 6 to 9 months. At least probably by this time next year, it will already be in place, probably.
Wow. This is so interesting. Like you said, it's so smart, such a good tactic to act like these passports are going away. And I mean, people who were up in arms about it now are feeling a little more at ease, even though there's like this sense of there's something else going on. We need to stay on top of it. There's a sense of, okay, things are easing up. And all the while, this is happening in the background. And the issue is, like you said, most people are just completely brainwashed and then they only know what's going on, what mainstream media tells them. So this kind of goes back a little bit, like my I don't know anyone other than, I would say, three people, one of which is my mother-in-law, and a one couple friend that my husband and I hang out with. Those are the only people that we know that are of the opinion that, okay, like, you do what you need to do, you make your own health decisions. Like, we believe in vaccines, but if you guys aren't vaccinated, that's fine. We'll hang out, whatever. But otherwise, like, or really just respect our opinion. But I would say, we just visited family in Hawaii where we were definitely treated in a way where we were shocked that a grandmother would treat, his grandson this way. Like, my husband was basically, our family needed to be masked outside and tested in order to be next to them, whereas the vaccinated people who have just as much of a likelihood to spread the condition didn't need to be masked up and could be right next to her and to care for her. I mean, I know that she's elderly, but still, I think that the mainstream media just has such pull to brainwash people. And like you said, the fear tactics are just so extraordinary that it's pulling families apart, and it's making it so that people feel righteous in their opinions. And so because most people are vaccinated, then they don't see an issue in these passports. And so I think your book is so important because it goes beyond that. That's not the conversation here about whether or not to be vaccinated. The conversation is that our privacy is getting taken away and it's not okay. And I just think it's interesting because, like, the Canadian truckers, for example, the Freedom Truckers, they were shown in mainstream media to be this, insane, dangerous, organized group of people who were considered racist and all these things. And that's the way the media had to spin it because they had to cover that, right? But I'm curious if you think there are any organizations out there that are more mainstream where people can, where they might be willing to share this information, where we might be able to put pressure on. Because I know there were so many protests during this time across Australia, across the UK, and just Europe in general, and even here, that were just never ever televised or spoken about. And there were, millions of people. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on if there are any organizations that you trust to, like, where do you look for the news?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that I look as far and as wide as possible. I think it's the only way to navigate the the situations, multiple situations we're kind of like trying to deal with, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it's the digital identity, whether it's the economic crisis that is certainly um, getting worse and worse. I think the only ways you can really be to any degree well informed or informed enough to form a reasonable picture of what is happening is if you are looking at multiple sources all the time. Unfortunately, most people don't have the time or the inclination to do that. Most people work 8, 9 hour days and they come home and they're shattered and they want to know what's going on, so they turn on the local news or they turn on the national news. And whether that's television, whether that's radio or whatever, it's that puts a huge amount of trust in those institutions. And unfortunately, we have seen that those institutions have been lacking in certain areas, and they have. I'm not sure if I'd use the word to brainwash, but they've certainly misinformed. And I would say in many cases, they're willfully misinformed. So we know, for example, in the United States, that Pfizer is sponsoring so many of the cable news programs and even the Oscars this year. It is almost impossible to escape the money trail when it comes to the pharmaceutical companies. It's almost impossible to escape the money trail, when it comes to an organization like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has been spreading hundreds of millions of dollars across media organizations around the world, media organizations that are desperate for money. And we're supposed to believe that this money comes with no strings attached. It's a little bit hard to imagine that. So, I mean, I think that we are dealing we're in a moment of time where so many of our institutions have been captured by corporate interests that it is essentially very difficult to trust so many of them. And this goes not just for media organizations, like at least the legacy media or corporate media. It goes for regulatory institutions. So we know that health regulators, the organizations that decide whether or not a medicine is safe or not, they are in part or largely funded by the same pharmaceutical companies whose products they're supposed to be regulating. That is a blatant conflict of interest.
And
And
same with the World Health Organization,
the World
right?
Health Organization is largely funded by private companies and private foundations. So I mean, like, it's something like around about 80% of all the money it receives is from private companies and foundations. And that is for me the fundamental reason, or one of the fundamental reasons why we should certainly be having a discussion about whether it's in the interest of the people on this planet that there is a global pandemic treaty that gives the World Health Organization so much power over our health policy, and probably more than that, because if they are able to dictate that every country on the planet uses vaccine passports, then vaccine passports, as I say, are a precursor to digital identity.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, that is giving the World Health Organization, and most importantly, those companies that are funding it, a huge amount of power over supposedly democratic countries.
So we have this piece here, right, where we understand like our audience, I would say, especially people listening to my podcast specifically, not just like reading our articles. Um, a lot of people in our audience understand, I would say, the issue with vaccine passports, the issue with privacy, how it goes into taking away our rights, our freedom. And I really am curious because diving into how vaccine passports are the gateway to digital identification for all, like you said, there's so many different pieces here, parts of the puzzle. The war on cash, I'd love for you to share a little bit about that because I would say a lot of people who understand this piece are still investing in Bitcoin, are for digital currency. And I'm very curious what your perspective is on all that and where you stand and how that plays a piece in the digital identification, because I think clearly that's part of it all.
Yeah, I mean, like it is kind of like a very important part of these moving parts that are taking us kind of like down this path towards what I sometimes call the digital utopia stroke dystopia. I mean, since the very beginning of this pandemic, cash has been heavily demonized. It already was for many years beforehand, but in the very first month of the pandemic, in February and March of 2020, the World Health Organization came out with their statement, which was a bit of an ambiguous statement. It kind of like said that, maybe cash could be a vector for the virus, and that was seized upon by many of the kind of enemies of cash, which is a very large group. We're talking about most specifically the credit card companies, the large tech companies like Apple, like Google. They've all very openly said they want to see the end of cash. Banks as well are desperate to see the end of cash. So I mean, it's a very large, very powerful group, and this one statement by the World Health Organization was seized upon by them. It was magnified by the mainstream media, and we kept being told that, stay away from cash. Cash is dangerous. It's not just dirty. It doesn't just facilitate tax evasion and all these other things that we've been told beforehand, but it's potentially life-threatening. And there were lots of questions about that, whether or not it was true or not. But I think that the doubt existed for long enough that this kind of like idea really set in. And in many countries, their use of cash declined significantly. In the UK, for example, I know people, friends of mine from the UK, that haven't used cash in the last 2 years. They literally haven't used cash for anything, which I find staggering. So I think a lot of people under the age of 50, 45, 50 are already kind of embracing the cashless economy,
Yeah.
cashless society. And this differs enormously from country to country. So this is why they have to be very, very proactive in this war against cash, because, if you go to the UK, people really don't use cash much at all. And those who do tend to be above the age of 50, 60. But if you come to a country like Spain, cash is used a lot more. And if you go to a country like Germany, it's used even more. So it's, each country has its own peculiarities, and some countries are more appreciative of cash than others. If you go to a country like Mexico, for example, 80, I think it's 87% of all transactions are still made in cash. So
Wow.
it's still very much a cash economy. And that is true for a lot of countries that are, economies that are less advanced, so to speak. And they have a very large informal economies as well. So it's the governments, I would say central banks, are also very keen to gradually do away with cash, because they know that, in a cashless economy, they can track and trace every just about every transaction, and that means they can tax just about every transaction. Banks can put fees on just about every transaction. So that is one of the things that is certainly informing the war on cash right now. But there's another thing that's really important that, again, most people don't quite realize, and that is the central bank digital currencies, which are, again, they're a vital cog in this kind of like this huge new system that is being gradually put into place. The central bank digital currencies are effectively, they will effectively revolutionize our economies. And yet most people don't know that they're even kind of happening. There are over 100 countries on the planet that are in the process of experimenting with or even piloting central bank digital currencies. And these are currencies that will, right now, when we use electronic money, when we pay with mobile phone or when we pay with credit cards, etc., this is all digital transactions. But all these digital transactions go through myriad institutions. It's a very complex web. And those are private institutions. It's a kind of decentralized system. It has a huge amount of flaws. It gives commercial banks essentially the power to create money. And that's what has been happening for many, 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 many years. Going back decades and decades and decades, central banks are the ones that create money by lending money into the economy. But a central bank digital currency, what it will do is it will take away the intermediary in this, which are the commercial banks, and it will mean that every person can have an account with the central bank. So in the case of the United States, it will be the Federal Reserve. And people say there are certain advantages of this. I mean, and there will be certain advantages of this. I mean, like, for example, it will be much more direct. It may be cheaper. There may be fewer bank fees in the middle of each transaction. That is also a possibility. But the risks, in my mind, are much, much greater. For a start, I can't see how they will allow this to occur without significantly sidelining cash a lot more, or even getting rid of it completely. Because this is money that is perfectly traceable. And central banks will be able to keep a track of every single transaction we make in this new reality. There will be kind of like, if there is no cash, there will be no way out of this kind of like panopticon economic system. And they will, and they've admitted this. They are kind of like salivating at the prospect of being able to keep track of our every payment. And it goes beyond that. They're also talking about being able to program money so that we will not be able to spend our money on certain things. So if they decide that,
What thing?
well, I mean, if they decide that maybe we've had a bit too much to drink, one particular week, they'll be able to stop us being able to buy more alcohol. Um,
Wow.
And the same goes for certain foods. Maybe they decide we're not eating healthy enough. But I mean, like it's that is something that again they are talking about. The Bank of England is openly suggesting that this could be a possibility. So not only will they be able to keep a track of what we're spending money on, they'll be able to potentially control what we can and cannot spend money on.
Which is so interesting to me because the whole movement for Bitcoin and these other currencies, obviously they're not the central bank currencies, but the whole movement is because people were saying it's decentralized, it's taking down the banks, it's actually going to shift things in a more positive direction. Like, what is your opinion on the ones that aren't central bank backed?
Whew, it's a good question. I mean, I am kind of agnostic when it comes to cryptocurrencies. I can see that there are certain advantages they have. There are major issues with cryptocurrencies. I think that they've been used up till now, certainly as more of a speculative asset than actual money in most cases. I think that the potential they have for decentralizing elements of the economy is can be potentially a good thing, especially if cash is done away with. So I mean, like,
Mm-hmm.
that's where I see cryptocurrency maybe have playing some sort of role.
Yeah.
But I wonder, I have serious questions as to whether or not they they will be tolerated, should we say? Because I mean, we've seen how a lot of governments have kind of like toughened their regulations. So I mean, like for example, in Spain right now, you are supposed to declare all the income you have generated through cryptocurrencies. That's something you're kind of got to do by law now. So it's like you can say, okay, well, I'm not going to do it, but if you get caught, then you're in serious trouble, and that is the case going to be the case more and more. So I think that a
There's no
lot
way
of
out.
I think it's one of my biggest concerns about cryptocurrencies is they've kind of like they've normalized digital money for so many people,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people are like, yeah, we're not going to be tracked, we're not going to be traced, but I think that one of the beauties for the central banks of cryptocurrencies is they've allowed them to see what happens, to see how digital money works. Um, and they've also conditioned people to the idea of digital money. Now, I'm not against digital money per se. I think that obviously, people we use digital money all the time.
Yeah.
I have a debit card that I use. I don't use credit cards, but I use debit cards. I don't use mobile money, but I respect everybody's right to do that. Although we saw recently in Russia what can happen if you are in the wrong country at the wrong time, you can just suddenly have your mobile money application just taken down. That is, again, it was an example of the risks of a digital money system. We saw again in Canada how the government um, essentially gave the banks the power to confiscate, to freeze the money of people who had been either involved in or donating, simply donating money to a protest movement that the government had decided was suddenly no longer legal. It's that is kind of like my major concern with a purely digital money system in the future. It gives too much power in the hands of very small number of very powerful actors. It's a consolidating, it's a centralizing system, and yeah, I think that the best we can hope for in the future is to have a system where you have digital and analog. I mean, cash is one of the most important final kind of like bastions of freedom we have left. It's one of the few things that allows us to still function as private, autonomous individuals. We can transact without having the bank in between extracting fees. So I mean, every time, most people don't realize that, when you use a credit card, when you use a debit card, the retailer pays a price. Um, it
Yeah.
is it is not a free transaction. And even like the typical mobile money apps that exist in Spain, we have one called Bizum, which is kind of like, at the moment, is free. It allows people to transact. People can send each other money free of charge, and a lot of people are enticed by that because it's so much easier than cash. You don't have to go to the bank and take out money, etc., etc. The problem is that once cash is gone, once the ultimate competitor has gone, there's nothing to stop banks increasing those charges, or to start, rather than increasing, but start applying charges to those services. I think that cash is a fundamental public good that, unfortunately, in many countries is not valued as such.
Yeah. Wow, it's a crazy time. I didn't have a smartphone during the pandemic for a long time, and I, just going around, even getting a menu at a restaurant, I couldn't even scan a barcode, and then they wouldn't give me the menu, and so it's the same thing with the cash, like they wouldn't accept cash. So it's definitely something that's expedited a lot of the things that I guess that the governments have wanted to do for a long time, or maybe it was all planned, depending on what people's thoughts are. But I'm just curious, I guess I know we're running short on time, but what would you say? I mean, this is like a really long question, I guess, in terms of, I'm sure the answer isn't quick, but what would you say is the worst case scenario vaccine, like passport situation? Let's say global pandemic treaty is approved, and we go down that line where we have vaccine passports. Like, what does that turn into? Because obviously, what are these other elements, like similar to the digital currencies, and that are playing a role in what will inevitably become these digital identifications for us and what they're tied to? And then, so please remember that. And then, like, what can we do today to help prevent this from happening?
Okay, worst case scenario. A worst case scenario is digital identity with central bank digital currencies. That is a worst case scenario. I mean, that is a world where I, at the very least, would not want to live in, because it will be a world where just about everything we do can be tracked, traced, and it's not just about tracking and tracing things we do, because to a certain extent, a lot of what we do is already tracked and traced by a lot of the tech companies. But it's the fact that these technologies can be used to force a large degree of compliance on people. So I mean, we've seen it with the vaccine passports. As long as you've taken your 2 vaccines, you can continue to interact and to function as a legal citizen, who is able to, who is eligible for services, etc., etc. And then they change that from 2 vaccines to 3 vaccines. So they change the rules as they go along. And I mean, that is a completely different society to the societies we've been living in over generations. These are societies where social contracts is completely changed. And the World Economic Forum, which has a large part to play in a lot of what is happening, openly admits this. This is about redesigning the social contract. And these technologies can be used to open up the so-called digital world for people, but they can also be used to close off the digital world. And not just the digital world, but the real world. They can close off your ability to leave your house, as has happened in Germany with and Austria with the kind of like the lockdowns of the unvaccinated. So, and once you have that linked up with once you have that linked up with money, which is inevitable with the central bank digital currencies. As the Financial Times recently reported, there's no way you can have central bank digital currencies without digital identities. Those two things come hand in hand. Once you have that, it essentially means that governments will have the means to control what we do. They will have the means to enforce behaviors, and that is a power we've never seen before. I think people struggle to understand what we're facing because it's not kind of like the totalitarian systems of the 20th century. It's not, these are not the tyrannies where you have a mustachioed man on the wall of every classroom, who we're supposed to revere if you are in that classroom, or you're supposed to, who go down in history as the butchers of societies. I mean, like there's no face to this tyranny, and I think that is what most terrifies me. We are going into kind of like this technocratic dictatorship, this what I call techno feudalist, techno-fascist dictatorship with our eyes closed. We're not even aware it's happening in most cases. So people are not engaging with reality, and it's about the loss of agency over our own lives, and that is what freedom is the ability to influence what happens in your environment. And if you are in the kind of like digital dystopia that they are trying to build, then you will lose that agency. And so, I mean, that's what most terrifies me. It's whether you want to call it privacy or freedoms or rights or whatever, those are all on the negotiating table right now, but we're not at the table. In fact, we're not even aware that that table exists in most cases. So, I mean, like, there's no public debate about this. So, I mean, like, yeah, I think that with regard to your second question, what can we do? We can start talking about this at dinner tables. We can start talking about it. And if people like say to you, well, this is just conspiracy theory, then I think we've got to have answers to that question, because it's not conspiracy theory. This is happening in front of us. And it is literally about battling in the war of ideas, battling it out and winning the fight. Because if we don't win this fight, then this is absolutely a fait accompli. This is guaranteed to happen.
Wow. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today. I am so inspired by, again, what you're sharing. And I know I completely agree with you. I think having these conversations with our loved ones, it starts with our loved ones, because if our
Yeah,
own loved ones can't hear us speak about this, then how can we go on to share this information with others? And
yeah, I could not agree more. I mean, this is not about, I say this in my book, this is not about whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. By now, given the limitations of the vaccines, in the sense that they do not protect you from catching it, they do not protect you from spreading it, getting vaccinated is, without a shadow of a doubt, a personal decision, or it should be a personal decision of each person. This is about something so much larger than that. This is about how our children, our grandchildren, the societies in which they're going to grow up, whether or not they're going to inherit the sort of freedoms, the sort of rights that we have lived with up until now. And it really is as simple as that.
it really is. And I have, yeah, I mean, when you were speaking, I just was like, the first thought that I always have is I just need to go get some land, protect this land, like find people who are willing to barter with, like, without, money essentially, and use our skills. I mean, that's like the life that it takes me. It's like I just want the complete opposite of this road that we're going down, just like you said. And so anything I can do to prevent this from happening to not just me, but my children and their children and everyone, I think, like you said, it just all comes back to our agency and our freedom. And I think in this day and age, at least in the United States, I mean, saying the word freedom even is just considered baffling. and unbelievable and racist, but then you see what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, they needed guns to go and fight for their freedom. And here we're, talking about like the fact that everything, we're just not allowed to have anything anymore, basically. And it's wild because I don't own a gun, but you bet if I'm going to go buy some land and I'm going to need to protect my family, like what is it that we're going to need to protect ourselves at that point? So it's all really interesting. And I
I mean,
just, again,
personally speaking, I think that it's. I mean, the US has this, that is different from a lot of countries in Europe. So I mean, that yes, you have the ability to bear arms, and that differs from state to state. But I mean, like, I think that we are in such a key moment that, I mean, the idea of kind of like just retiring to some land and kind of like hoping that you're gonna be able to live it out. I think that is probably a dream,
yeah,
because the amount of power and control that these changes, these technological changes, will give to kind of like central planners, it's going to be very hard to live on the edge of that. It's not going to be impossible. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of people living on the edge of that, but it ain't going to be a pretty existence. So
yeah,
I think it's fundamental that people realize that there is a window of opportunity, and while we still live in supposedly democratic societies, while we still enjoy certain rights, we need to exercise those rights, and we need to begin pushing back against what is happening. And the only way to do that is, as I said, is first of all trying to make sure that this conversation is taking place at a state level, at a local level, at a family level, and yeah, it's trying to make sure. I know that certain people in my family are beginning to see things differently, but I mean that's because I've written a book about it and I've read it.
yeah.
So it's like, whether or not we can push this forth and move it on. I think that is the big question. So I hope anyway. I hope this conversation helps in some way or another.